Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arlene Sachs, and this is Chuck Mason.
And we want to thank, before we forget, the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society for being our sponsor. Janelle is normally with me here, but she's not able to be with us today. And today we're going to talk about understanding records and what they're actually telling us, because we really need to understand a number of things when we deal with records. If I said to somebody who was attending church today about a pew, their idea of a pew would be different from what a pew would be in colonial times. For many of our ancestors, particularly those who were members of the Church of England, a pew was actually a box which had a door to it, to the aisle, and seating on three of the other sides with hopefully padding. And, the Church of England has even got away from that, although historic churches like the Christ Church down in Old Town Alexandria, where George Washington went, they still have, although they have taken some of those out and replaced them with the traditional pew that we think about today.
I think the point there is that you have to understand the times, and that's so important, to understand the history of what was going on, what things were like, which we can't. It's very difficult,
And we have to understand the meaning of those words. So, one of the things that can really trip us up, and I've found this a number of times, is terms for relationships have changed over time. When we talk about in-laws today, it's your spouse's family, but in colonial times and little later at least, it was also used to refer to step-parents and step-families. So, you would talk about in-laws, and is it actually the in-laws or is it the step-family of the person?
Is it just that we're being more specific, or did those words totally not exist?
I don't know about step-parents or step-family. I think that is a more modern term. But some things, it was just, the words that they used. For example, cousin could refer to, early on, any relationship by blood or marriage.
Well, I think in some ways life was more formal. So in order to say, to show that they were closer than being real formal, they called them cousins or uncles or something like that.
They also used it for niece and nephew. so there again, you have to understand.
Well, I think
those
some cultures do that today too.
Yeah.
I don't know which ones, but I've read something like that.
And early on, prior to the mid-1700s, nephew was used for both niece and nephew.
Oh.
So if you're looking at an old document, an old will, and they may say, my nephew, but it's obvious, if it's Mary or Sally, it's going to be a clue. But if you have somebody named Leslie or another, first name that could be male or female, you might have a problem with
even Sally can be a man's name in German.
Yes.
It's a very valid. So even that, if you're coming or dealing with immigrants.
Yeah. And another one is brother. Brother was used. You have a brother, could be a male or a female, has a male sibling, that's a brother, but also it's used to describe brother-in-laws. It's used to there again, is it your sister's husband? Is it her another sister's husband? And also, it was also used to describe relationships to certain members of the clergy in churches. So you have that. One of my favorites is always, and this is one that you really have to understand. Today, we use senior and junior when we're talking about father and son. I'm a junior. I'm named after my father. But in earlier times, it didn't necessarily mean that they were even related by blood.
Oh, really?
It could be two men with the same name, could be two John Smiths living in the same town, two different, completely different Smith families, or it could be an uncle and a nephew. And I have a favorite with my Pancoast line. Ambrose was my third great-grandfather. He never used senior or junior. He had a son who was Ambrose Jr. One of his other sons named his son Ambrose, and he used junior. And one of Ambrose Jr., who was actually the grandson's cousins, named his son Ambrose, and he was junior. So I have to look at the whole record. I have to see the grandson didn't actually marry. He died fairly young. So records of him are fairly easy to distinguish, but I have to look at the time frame of the records and who was alive, and also look for wives to distinguish
I think
which Ambrose are we talking about.
But I think this happens not only with the junior and senior, because my husband's mother had a first cousin who was exactly the same name, the two brothers, because in the Jewish religion, you name after someone that had died. They were both named after the grandmother. They were born within a year of each other. So if you just went back to that town and we were looking for Sophie Selig, I found the right one. But unless you knew something before that, what her parents' names were from this country, you might hit the wrong one. And that's certainly true with much more common names,
well, and
too.
of course, you have that naming pattern in certain European countries where they would name the oldest boy after the grandfather, the father's father, and then if there was a second son, the mother's father, and they flipped it for girls, it was after the mother's mother. And so you could very well have brothers and sisters who are, naming their children like was the custom with Jews.
That was very common.
And so you really have to understand those naming patterns and things. Another term that throws people off in wills is the man may refer to my now wife. And some people, particularly beginners, think, well, he had a wife before. No, he was just referring to his wife when the will was written. And she may or may not be the wife when the will goes to probate. I have one case where he says, my now wife, doesn't name her, but when his will actually went to probate, his first wife had died and he married his second wife. And so it was his second wife that actually was inheriting from him.
Well, wouldn't if he willed it to his first wife, it wouldn't have gone to like her siblings or her family or something like that?
Well, depending on the probate law and what else was written in the will. I mean, in this case, he did leave things to his children. So things went to his children by his first wife, but his second wife actually did the inheriting of what was originally intended for his first wife. And talking about wills kinds of brings up legal terms. I always tell people, don't take and assume you know what everything means in a legal document. If you're not sure, if you haven't really read it, go read the definition, because things you may only know part of the definition. You may know part of it, but there may be more. One of the ones that threw me off early on was they were talking about infants, and I think of an infant as a young child, year or two old. And I knew some of these kids were in their early teens. When I went and looked the definition up, it actually is any child under the age of majority. So for the most part, early on it was females 18 and males 21. Another one that threw me off was orphan. My grandfather talked about his father being orphaned, and I actually, in looking at my great-grandparents, I found them in 1870 in the census. I couldn't find him in the 1875 state census for New Jersey, and he was living with his aunt and uncle in another county in 1880. So I assumed they died between 1870 and 1875. They didn't. They actually died in 1880 and 81. But the legal definition of orphan is anybody who loses a parent at any age. So at 50 plus, when I lost my father, I became an orphan. But that totally threw off my research of trying to research my grandfather's family.
Well, I think that happens too. When one parent died, the spouse had no way. They didn't have daycare centers. They didn't. And if you didn't have a grandmother or an aunt or somebody to leave the child with, you had no way of earning a living. In my husband's family, 5 children were sent to an orphanage and grew up in the orphanage because the husband was gone and the woman had to work.
Yes.
And you could see the progression. I got the records from the orphanage of when the youngest child didn't go in until she was, I don't know, 4 or something. So she was with the mother for a few years, but they remained very close, which surprised me because they were in city. One was in Cleveland, I think it was Cleveland, and the other in Chicago. The mother was in Chicago. The burial, the mother's in the middle, and all of the children and their spouses are around her. So even though they were in an orphanage and grew up until they were 16 in the orphanage, they still maintained a close relationship with the mother. I don't know that. I think that's rare.
But I think you're right there. If they end up in an orphanage, a lot of times they didn't know. If they were lucky, then other family members, they would go live with other family members, and that sometimes throws another problem in, because I will see people listed or children listed as adopted when in fact there's no legal adoption taking place. It's just they moved in, or the father dies and the mother remarries and it says they're the adopted children of, but there wasn't a formal adoption.
Yeah, I don't think you needed that. I mean, it's enough that the new father is supporting them and all of that. So, there wasn't any need to go through that.
Early on, adoptions were acts of the state legislature. And so it was only when I first looked into this for someone, it was into the 1870s before they had adoptions in New Jersey through the court system as we know it. And so it was only the very rich that could afford to have this adoption sponsored by the legislature and have it go through the state legislature.
When the children were adopted, whether it was formally or informally, did they take the name of the adopted family? Or
often they did.
So maybe that's what they meant by adopted.
They did. They would change the name. But I've also, census takers also throw us off, because I've seen cases where children will be listed and they're young children. The wife has remarried, so it's the couple's children. And then her children are listed under, and you can tell because they're older, but the census taker put the little ditto marks for the surname, when in fact I know the kids went through life using their father's name, their actual surname, because they weren't
again, probably
adopted.
The census taker didn't ask. Whoever answered gave those names, and we tend to think that the censuses are without any errors, but we have to remember that There were language problems, and the census taker never would have assumed to ask how you spell something, because then they would have been taken for being dumb. Because
in reality, censuses are notorious for mistakes. I'm very lucky. My great-grandparents are enumerated twice in the 1910 census in Philadelphia. So I now know the 5-day period that they moved from one address to another, because they're at one address on Thursday and a new address on Monday. And I can guess, based on their jobs, that they probably moved Saturday afternoon or evening and Sunday to the new location. But when the census taker came around, they didn't ask the questions appropriately. And the family's not exactly the same. You know, ages are off a little.
Are you sure it's not a different family?
Oh no, it's definitely the family. I mean, it's close enough, but it's, you know, a couple of places the job or the job title is different for
somebody else
couple
answered
of the kids.
the question.
Somebody else probably
because
answered
we have one
the
case
questions.
in Sid's family where in one census, one brother's the oldest, and then the 10 years later, it's the other brother that's the oldest. Or either that, or one was born in Illinois and one in Utah, and the other way around, something like that. Yeah. But it just depended on who answered the questions.
Right. And of course, another thing that we have to deal with in addition to legal terms sometimes is medical terms. You know, especially if we're looking at death certificates and things like that. And those things have changed over time. You know, one of the most interesting lectures that I listened to at a conference was a number of years ago, where a medical doctor was the lecturer, and he went through the whole scenario of this man being brought into the emergency room and the various things that were going on. You know, he had to have surgery. So if he had died before he got to the hospital, if he died in the emergency room, if he died while he was in the operating room, or if he died after the operation and all. And some of the medical terms were different depending on where the scenario was. And of course, diseases that we know today were often called different things in the past. So to understand those kinds of things, we really have to
you have
know
to understand
terms.
the times. And I don't think I understand. A beginner certainly doesn't understand that.
No.
And it took me a long, long time to really understand. You have to understand what was going on someplace. And when you see something, it really helps to have a very old dictionary.
Yes.
I'm sure that there are old English dictionaries that are available in antique stores. Probably can't do better than get a hold of one of those, or go to a library that has something like that.
Well, of course, today we have something called the internet.
Yeah, but they don't necessarily have those old words.
Well, a lot of terms I find, if you know, I do. I have a CD of an old medical dictionary, and then I have a couple of others that are modern publications, but they're talking about the old terms, and then I have several editions of Black's Law Dictionary. But today I find most of the time, if I do an internet search, I get pretty much what is in those dictionaries. Occasionally there'll be something that I'll have to go back.
Well, I have, when I was doing a lot of German-English translation, I found an 1885 German-English dictionary. And there were words in there that even in that time were already defined as, this word means so-and-so, but it's obsolete. And so if it was obsolete 130 years ago, I don't think you'll find it today.
Well, and the other thing that we deal with language is, is where is it that they are living? You know, is there the local colloquialisms and things like that? Here in the United States, I had cousins that moved from New Jersey to Florida, and particularly not my youngest cousin, who was born after they moved to Florida, but the last one born in New Jersey. When she came up to visit one time, I couldn't understand half of what she was saying because of the Southern accent that she had picked up, because she was just really beginning to learn to talk when they had moved down to Florida. And another thing is expressions that are more local, things that when I first met my in-laws, lived down in the Hampton, Virginia area, and they're talking about carrying the car in to have it repaired, and I'm thinking they're picking it up and lifting it.
Well, there's a term for an apartment with another apartment directly above it, which is totally unknown in this area, but it's called a two-flat in Chicago. And when I used that term, because my son bought a house that was a two-flat, and nobody I talked to had ever heard that term. Well, what he did was convert it into a single-family home eventually. But it's a term that's totally unknown here, so it's a regional thing, but they have they have buildings that are two-flats, but it's not a townhouse. It's a single family standing.
Well, and one of the things that I grew up in, there were houses that were side by side, where they called them duplexes.
Yeah, but that's
when
I could call it.
When I was growing up, and now they don't use that term anymore.
Well, that's what I would call it.
Yeah, just
what do they call it now?
I forget what the people that have bought the one that was around the corner from where I lived, they've actually broken through and made it into a one family unit.
Like
now.
What I would have called a townhouse years ago, they now call villas. So it makes it sound fancy when they sell it.
Well, and just depending on the area, it does often take and change the meaning for us. And then we also, because we often have ancestors from foreign countries, have the mix of foreign terms mixed into the language and the records and things that we're
I haven't
dealing
seen that
with.
too much in records.
Well, sometimes I have, though, depending on if it's a document that somebody is writing, they may do a mix of things. If it's a legal document, usually not. But if you have a letter from somebody, you can have things.
The names can
be
like the name Sally is a perfectly valid German man's name. And yet, if you read "Sally is coming," you would be looking for a female. And then if you see ship arrival records or something, S so and so male, you wouldn't think that would be him. Yeah. So you can run into trouble there.
Yeah, and of course, then with dealing with the documents, one of the things that we often have problems with is spelling and grammar. Reading those old documents where before we had formal education, if it's just our ancestor writing up the document, as long as they could understand it, it was accepted. So they would write what they actually heard and spell it.
But it's not only people that were semi-literate. It's even in things maybe George Washington or somebody wrote, they spelled things completely different. and differently at different times. So it was what they heard as opposed to a formal. I have no idea when formal spelling came into being.
I think more probably the late 19th century where we get more formal education where people are not being taught at home. They're actually going out. And of course, handwriting can of course affect it, reading people's handwriting.
Especially foreign. I mean, you look at the old German, and it's interesting, the old German letters are just like if you look at the Declaration of Independence, like an F with the loop in the back is really an S, and that's the same in the Declaration of Independence of 200 and some years ago as it is in German documents.
Yeah, and of course, punctuation and abbreviations is another problem. I tell people, when you are looking at a document and you've got a list of names, don't be surprised if you find out that you have a mixture of their given name and their middle name, and other children may be mentioned only by their given name and there's no commas in between. Don't start adding them in, because you may add things in and that changes things.
Oh yeah.
I had one person, they trying to help them, and they were looking for this one family member, and we couldn't find anything in the records. And I said to them, well, where did you get these names? And they gave me a will. While I start looking at the will, there's almost no commas between. And what it finally ended up being was, what they were looking for as a given name or a first name was actually the middle name
of somebody else.
And so we were looking for somebody that didn't exist. Because,
well, the only other thing I can think of is the geographic changes. Especially in Europe, where you could live in one city and live in 5 countries and have to sort of speak 5 languages without ever moving out of your house.
Well,
and in this country too.
As things were divided, there's one county in Kentucky that within, I think it was a year or a little over a year's time, it was divided 5 different times.
Oh my God.
And the original parent county name remained until the final division, and then it disappeared. So you have to know the history, and streets did the same thing.
Streets did the same thing and still do. There's street just near us that was just, a new street contained the old street name, and the old street now became Workhouse Road instead of being Lorton Road. So it's constantly helping.
And where I grew up, the township, they had to change a lot of names because they put 911 calling in, and they had different numbered streets in the towns within the township, and the same names. I think they had 5 Summit Avenues. So Summit Avenue, which was next to the house next to us, became Selby Avenue. So,
well, I think the thing is that we have to remember to have to understand exactly when it was written and what was going on at that time.
So we're out of time.